Hello, we are going to cover Chapter 14 today, Government and the Economy. And I'm going to start you out by directing you to your at-home lecture notes, and I am going to explain what exactly KWL is. What KWL stands for is what you know, what you want to know, and then later what you have learned. So if you take a look at your notes, you will see that there is a place for you to respond to what you know. So in this location, you're going to write down anything that you already know about the government and the economy. So you can either define these two terms in your own words, or you can just write down a few words that come to mind when you see these terms. And then after that, you are going to skip to the W, and that's what you want to know. And there you will write out at least 1, 2, even 3 questions that you would like answered. Try to make them more open-ended, thought-provoking questions, and then we will refer back to those questions at the end of the chapter. Okay, so go ahead and pause your recording and then answer these 2 prompts, and then we'll go from there. Okay, we're going to start out by talking about economic systems. An economic system is a social institution, so we've defined these already. A social institution can be government, it can be education, religion, the healthcare system, etc. It's defined as, economic system itself is defined as an institution in which goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. We don't often think of the economic system as a social institution because, unlike, for example, schools, we don't go to one place and participate in whatever goods and services it is that that institution provides. The economic system is actually so well intertwined in our lives that we don't even recognize it. So for example, you'll go to Starbucks, you buy your caramel frappuccino, and when you're doing that, you're actually contributing and participating in our economic system just by consuming, so purchasing coffee. So our economic system is everywhere you look. And what we're going to do here is define different types of economic systems, starting with capitalism. So capitalism is defined as an economic system in which means of production are held largely in private hands. So basically, the incentive for a capitalist society is to make money. And what it means when it says that it's held in private hands is that anybody can go out and own a business, and if that business is successful, they own the profits, they make the profits, and they can become perhaps millionaires by having a successful business. In the U.S., this is what we practice. There are varying degrees of capitalism, and that kind of just depends on how much involvement the government takes on to regulate particular industries. What's known as contemporary capitalism, for example, has government regulation, and contemporary capitalist societies do not tolerate monopolistic practices, and we'll define monopolies in a little bit here. One form of capitalism that involves very little government regulation is laissez-faire. This is a French word, and it literally means let them do. So when you think of the words let them do, it kind of means mind your own business, leave them alone, and that's exactly what it means. The definition is businesses compete with minimal government intervention. Currently, it's difficult to identify one particular society that operates with little government intervention or no government intervention, and this could probably be considered a good thing. So on your slide 3 notes, it asks you to answer a couple questions. First of all, I'd like for you to try to brainstorm and think of one type of organization, one particular organization or institution that the government regulates. And what I mean by regulates is establishes rules. So the government says, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that, and it gives you varying degrees of how much you can bend this rule, how much you can break that rule, and what are the fines if you do break those rules. So one, you're going to think of an organization or institution that the government regulates. Second, write down an example of a type of rule that the government establishes for that particular industry that you wrote down for number 1. And then for number 3, write down what you think could happen if the government didn't establish that particular rule. And if you lost me a little bit on the instructions, that's okay. If you press pause, you can take a look at your notes, and it explains 1, 2, and 3 exactly what you should be doing for this particular part. So go ahead and pause it, answer those questions, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so the reason that capitalist societies establish governmental regulations is to avoid things such as a monopoly. And what a monopoly is when a single firm controls the market. So you all think of Monopoly the game, and actually a little fun side fact is that the game Monopoly was actually established to kind of poke fun at capitalism, but it ended up being a very popular table game that we all played growing up. Anyway, so a monopoly is when you have a single firm that controls the market. Think about particular companies where if you want a product, you just have to go through them. A lot of people might call Apple products a monopoly because if you buy an iPhone, you can't particularly use other products, say Sony technical products or Dell, because they're pretty much not compatible. So if you have an iPhone and you want to access music and you want it downloaded onto your phone, you typically need to use iTunes. So in a sense, Apple has somewhat monopolized that particular industry to make it so that you have to buy all Apple products in order for you to be able to use multimedia. So what I'm going to do, if you take a look at this little box in the bottom right-hand corner, is I'm going to have you brainstorm an idea of a monopoly, or if you're having a hard time to think of your own, you can go to this link at the bottom of the page and take a look at a list of modern monopolies. Write down at least 1 to 2 on the list, or you can go with your own ideas. So pause, go to this particular URL right here, and write down 1 to 2 monopolies. Okay, so moving on from capitalism, we are going to define and discuss socialism and communism. So socialism was really defined with the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and it's defined as a means of production and distribution owned collectively rather than privately owned. So collectively means owned by all. The basic objective of socialism is to meet people's needs. So let's make sure people are provided for rather than to just make profit and become wealthy millionaires. Basically, the wealth is to help everyone collectively, so everyone is taken care of, and they're able to get an education, they're able to receive health care, everybody has food on their table, etc. Marx believed that each socialist state would eventually become a communist state in which all property is communally owned as well. So everybody owns all property. There's no such thing as private property. So you don't own your home, etc. It's all owned by everybody. And he thought that socialist states would also evolve so that there's no class distinction whatsoever. So there's no such thing as middle class, upper class, lower class. Everybody is of the same class. Our definition of communism is an economic system under which all property is communally owned and no social distinctions are made of the basis of people's ability to produce. Okay, so socialism and communism have a lot of characteristics in common, and they also have some differentiating traits as well. So it's difficult for many people to distinguish the difference between socialism and communism. And right now, just looking at these definitions, you might be able to see how they are alike and how they're different. And if you can identify any ways in which they're the same or different, I would highly recommend you write them down. But this is a concept that we will come back to during class. We're going to complete a web search activity where we're really distinguishing the difference and making sure we understand the difference between communism and socialism. But for the time being, if you can identify any just looking at these definitions, perhaps press pause, write down a couple things that differentiate the two from each other, a couple things they have in common. That would definitely help you have a head start for our in-class activity. Okay, we're moving on to power and authority. We're going to first start by defining political system, which is a social institution responsible for implementing and achieving society's goals. So just like religion and the family, the political system is a cultural universal, so it's found in every society However, it's certainly structured differently across different societies. In the U.S., if you look on the right-hand side, we are a democracy, which we'll define a little bit later. We practice a checks and balances system so that no particular branch of our government system, of our political system, has all the power or too much power. It's broken into 3 branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And you can look and see on this chart a little bit of their particular responsibilities. The political system also interacts closely with the economic system, and we've already defined economic system, but it's there for you again. And if you think about when you turn on the news and you hear about what's going on in our capital, you'll find that our government, our House of Representatives and Congress are often voting on things such as budget plans, and that certainly has a lot to do with our economic system. Laswell, who is a political scientist, came up with a definition of politics that's a real quick and catchy way to remember it. It's defined as who gets what, when, and how. Okay, so we've defined political system, and now we're going to break down the basic types of government. There are basically 5 types of government, and you'll see that there is a list for you in your notes where you can define each type of government. We're going to start with the monarchy, and a monarchy is a form of government headed by a single member of a royal family, so a king, a queen, or some other hereditary member. And there are different forms of monarchies. You can see in this bottom right-hand corner, I don't know if many of you recognize this particular woman, but this is Queen Elizabeth. She is the Queen of the United Kingdom, and her sort of rulership is known more symbolically. Sometimes they call it a ceremonial figurehead, meaning she symbolically rules. However, it's their parliament in Great Britain who determines the laws, who establishes the rules, who balances the budget, and etc. Her ruling is more symbolic, whereas in other countries, very rare, but you do see absolute monarchy. So in the picture right here to the right of Queen Elizabeth, you have King Abdullah, who is the ruler of Saudi Arabia. So he was born into his position, and he has power over legislative powers, like he is able to enact and establish laws, etc. The second form of government is an oligarchy, and this is a government in which a few individuals rule. Many American anti-government activists would probably argue that the U.S. is an oligarchy because although we have a democratic system, which I'll define in a little bit, it is truly just a select few people who have a decision-making influence, and that influence is mostly determined by who has the most money, corporations, and the best lobbyists, corporations. So although the U.S. is not defined as an oligarchy, some people would argue that it is. Next is a dictatorship. This is a government where one person has nearly total power to enforce laws. And actually, if you do have some extra time, there's always a fun web search you can do to look up the world's dictators, and you'll find a wealth of lists ranking dictators based on how cruel they are, etc. When these dictators have such overwhelming control over people's lives, it is then referred to, or the government is then called, totalitarian. So again, the next form, the fourth one, is totalitarian government. This is when the dictators have overwhelming control over people's lives. North Korea's Kim Jong-un is a great example of this. You could see him right here. And next we have a democracy, which you'll see practiced in the U.S. and many other westernized cultures. And democracy means by the people. In most of these cases, a government is a representation of the people. So people put them into office, and they put them into office because they expect that those elected officials, senators, Congress, they expect them to represent the needs and the wants and the desires